Chapter 8. The Philosophy of the Utopians. The Utopians wonder how any man should be so taken with the glaring, doubtful lustre of a jewel or a stone that can look up to a star or to the sun himself, or how any should value himself because his cloth is made of a finer thread. For, how fine soever that thread may be, it was once no better than the fleece of a sheep, and that sheep was a sheep still, for all it was wearing. They wonder much to hear that gold, which in itself is a thing so useless, should be everywhere so much esteemed that every man, for whom it was made, and by whom it has its value, should yet be thought of as less value than this metal, that a man of lead, who has no more sense than a log of wood, and is as bad as he is foolish, should have many wise and good men to serve him, only because he has a great heap of that metal, and that if it should happen that by some accident or trick of law, which sometimes produces as great changes as chance itself, all this wealth should pass from the master to the meanest valet of his whole family, he himself would very soon become one of his servants, as if he were a thing that belonged to his wealth, and so were bound to follow its fortune. But they much more admire and detest the folly of those who, when they see a rich man, though they neither owe him anything, nor are in any sort of dependency upon his bounty, yet merely because he is rich, give him a little less than divine honours, even though they know him to be so covetous and base-minded that notwithstanding all his wealth, he will not part with one farthing of it to them as long as he lives. These and such like notions have the people imbibed, partly from their education, being bred in a country whose laws and customs are opposed to all such foolish maxims, and partly from their learning and studies. For though there are but few in any town that are so wholly excused from labour as to give themselves entirely up to their studies, these being only such persons as discover from their childhood an extraordinary capacity and disposition for letters, yet their children and a great part of the nation, both men and women, are taught to spend those hours in which they are not obliged to work in reading, and this they do through the whole progress of life. They have all their learning in their own language, which is both a copious and pleasant language, and in which a man can fully express his mind. It runs over a great tract of many countries, but is not equally pure in all places. They had never so much as heard of the names of those philosophers that are so famous in these parts of the world before we went among them. And yet they had made the same discoveries as the Greeks, both in music, logic, arithmetic, and geometry. But as they are almost in everything equal to the ancient philosophers, so they far exceed our modern logicians, for they have never yet fallen upon the barbarous niceties that our youths are forced to learn in those trifling logical schools that are among us. They are so far from minding chimeras and fantastical images made in the mind, that none of them could comprehend what we meant when we talked to them of a man in the abstract as common to all men in particular, so that though we spoke of him as a thing that we could point at with our fingers, yet none of them could perceive him, and yet distinct from everyone, as if he were some monstrous colossus or giant. Yet, for all this ignorance of those empty notions, they knew astronomy, and were perfectly acquainted with the motion of the heavenly bodies, and have many instruments well contrived and divided, by which they very accurately compute the course and positions of the sun, moon, and stars. But for the cheat of divining by the stars, by their oppositions or conjunctions, it has not so much as entered into their thoughts. They have a particular sagacity, founded upon much observation, in judging of the weather, by which they know when they may look for rain, wind, or other alterations in the air. But as to the philosophy of these things, the cause of the saltiness of the sea, of its ebbing and flowing, and of the origin and nature both of the heavens and the earth, They dispute of them partly as our ancient philosophers have done, and partly upon some new hypothesis, in which, as they differ from them, so they do not in all things agree among themselves. As to moral philosophy, they have the same disputes among them as we have here. They examine what are properly good, both for the body and the mind, and whether any outward thing can be called truly good, or in that term belong only to the endowment of the soul. They inquire likewise into the nature of virtue and pleasure, but their chief dispute is concerning the happiness of man, and wherein it consists, whether in some one thing or in a great many. They seem indeed more inclined to that opinion that places, if not the whole, yet the chief part of man's happiness in pleasure. And, what may seem more strange, they make use of arguments from religion, notwithstanding its severity and roughness, for the support of that opinion so indulgent to pleasure. For they never dispute concerning happiness without fetching some arguments from the principles of religion, as well as from natural reason, since without the former they reckon that all our inquiries after happiness must be but conjectural and defective. These are their religious principles: that the soul of man is immortal, and that God, of his goodness, has designed that it should be happy, and that he has therefore appointed rewards for good and virtuous actions, and punishments for vice, to be distributed after this life. Though these principles of religion are conveyed down among them by tradition, they think that even reason itself determines a man to believe and acknowledge them, and freely confess that if these were taken away, no man would be so insensible as to not seek after pleasure by all possible means, lawful or unlawful, using only this caution, that a lesser pleasure might not stand in the way of a greater, and that no pleasure ought to be pursued that should draw a great deal of pain after it. For they think it the maddest thing in the world to pursue virtue, that is a sour and difficult thing, and not only to renounce the pleasures of life, but willingly undergo much pain and trouble, if a man has no prospect of a reward. And what reward can there be for one that has passed his whole life, not only without pleasure, but in pain? For there is nothing to be expected after death. Yet they do not place happiness in all sorts of pleasures, but only in those that in themselves are good and honest. There is a party among them who place happiness in bare virtue. Others think that our natures are conducted by virtue to happiness, as that which is chief good of man. They define virtue thus, that it is living according to nature, and think that we are made by God for that end. They believe that a man that then follows the dictates of nature, when he pursues or avoids things according to the direction of reason. They say that the first dictate of reason is the kindling in us a love and a reverence of the divine majesty, to whom we owe both all that we have and all that we ever hope for. In the next place, reason directs us to keep our minds as free from passion and as cheerful as we can, and that we should consider ourselves as bound by the ties of good nature and humanity to use our utmost endeavours to help forward the happiness of all other persons. For there never was any man such a morose and severe pursuer of virtue, such an enemy to pleasure, that though he set hard rules for men to undergo, much pain, many watchings, and other rigours, yet did not at the same time advise them to do all they could in order to relieve and ease the miserable, and who did not represent gentleness and good nature as admirable dispositions. And from thence they infer that if a man ought to advance the welfare and comfort of the rest of mankind, there being no virtue more proper and peculiar to our nature than to ease the miseries of others, to free from trouble and anxiety, in furnishing them with the comforts of life, in which pleasure consists. Nature much more vigorously leads them to do all this for himself. A life of pleasure is either a real evil, and in that case we ought not to assist others in their pursuit of it, but, on the contrary, to keep them from it all we can, as from that which is most hurtful and deadly. Or, if it is a good thing, so that we not only may, but ought to help others to it. Why then ought not a man to begin with himself? Since no man can be more bound to look after the good of another than after his own. For nature cannot direct us to be good and kind to others, and yet at the same time be unmerciful and cruel to ourselves. Thus, as they define virtue to be living according to nature, so they imagine that nature prompts all people on it to seek after pleasure as the end of all that they do. They also observe that in order to our supporting the pleasures of life, nature inclines us to enter into society. For there is no man so much raised above the rest of mankind as to be the only favourite of nature, who, on the contrary, seems to have placed on a level all those that be to the same species. Upon this they infer that no man ought to seek his own conveniences so eagerly as to prejudice others, and, therefore, they think that not only all agreements between private persons ought to be observed, but, likewise, that all those laws ought to be kept, which either a good prince has published in due form, or which a people that is neither oppressed with tyranny nor circumvented by fraud has consented, for distributing those conveniences of life which afford us all our pleasures. They think that is an evidence of true wisdom for a man to pursue his own advantage as far as the law allows it. They account it piety to prefer the public good to one's private concerns, but they think it unjust for a man to seek for pleasure by snatching another man's pleasure from him. And, on the contrary, they think it a sign of a gentle and good soul for a man to dispense with his own advantage for the good of others, and that by this means a good man finds as much pleasure one way as he parts with another, whereas he may expect the like from others when he may come to need of it. So, if that should fail him, yet the sense of a good action, and the reflections that he makes on the love and gratitude of those whom he has so obliged, gives the mind more pleasure than the body could have found in that form which it has restrained itself. They are also persuaded that God will make up the loss of those small pleasures with a vast and endless joy, of which religion easily convinces a good soul. Thus, upon an inquiry into the whole matter, they reckon that all our actions, and even all our virtues, terminate in pleasure, as in our chief end and greatest happiness, and they call every motion or state, either of body or mind, in which nature teaches us to delight, a pleasure. Thus, they cautiously limit pleasure only to those appetites to which nature leads us. For they say that nature leads us only to those delights to which reason as well as sense carries us, and by which we neither injure any other persons, nor lose the possession of greater pleasures, and of such as draw no troubles after them. But they look upon those delights which men by a foolish though common mistake call pleasure, as if they could change as easily the nature of the things as the use of words, as things that greatly obstruct their real happiness, instead of advancing it, because they so entirely possess the minds of those that were once captivated by them with a false notion of pleasure, that there is no room left for pleasures of a truer or purer kind. There are many things that in themselves have nothing that is truly delightful. On the contrary, they have a good deal of bitterness in them. And yet, from our perverse appetites after forbidden objects, are not only ranked among the pleasures, but are made even the greatest designs of life. Among those who pursue these sophisticated pleasures, they reckon such as I mentioned before, who think themselves really the better for having fine clothes, in which they think they are doubly mistaken, both in the opinion that they have of their clothes, and in that which they have for themselves. For if you consider the use of clothes, why should a fine thread be thought of better than a coarse one? And yet these men, as if they had some real advantage beyond others, and did not owe them wholly to their mistakes, look big, seem to fancy themselves to be more valuable, and imagine that a respect is due them for the sake of their rich garment, to which they would not have pretended if they had been more meanly clothed, and even resent it as an affront if that respect is not paid them. It is also a great folly to be taken with outward marks of respect, which signify nothing. For what true or real pleasure can one man find in another's standing bare, or making legs to him? Will the bending another man's knee give ease to yours? And will the head being bare cure the madness of yours? And yet it is wonderful to see how this false notion of pleasure bewitches many which delight themselves with the fancy of nobility, and are pleased with this conceit, that they are descended from ancestors who have been held for some succession of riches, and who have had great possessions. For this is all that makes nobility at present. Yet they do not think themselves a whit the less noble, though their immediate parents have left none of this wealth to them, although they themselves have squandered it away. The Utopians have no better opinion of those who are much taken with gems and precious stone, and who account it a degree of happiness next to a divine one, if they can purchase one that is very extraordinary, especially if it be of that sort of stones that is then in greatest request, for the same sort is not at all times universally of the same value, nor will men buy it unless it be dismounted and taken out of the gold. The jeweller is then made to give a good security, and to require solemnly to swear that the stone is true, that, by such an exact caution, a false one might not be bought instead of a true, though, if they were to examine it, your eye could find no difference between the counterfeit and that which is true, so that they are all one to you, as much as if you were blind. Or can it be thought that those who heap up a useless mass of wealth, not for any use that it is to bring them, but merely to please themselves with the contemplation of it, enjoy any true pleasure in it? The delight they find is only a false shadow of joy. Those are no better, whose error is somewhat different from the former, and who hide it out of their fear of losing it. For what other name can fit the hiding it in the earth, or, rather, the restoring it to it again, it being thus cut off from being useful either to its owner or to the rest of mankind? And yet the owner, having hid it carefully, is glad, because he thinks he is now sure of it. If it should be stole, the owner, though he may live perhaps 10 years after the theft, of which he knew nothing, would find no difference between his having it or losing it, for both ways are equally useless to him. Among those foolish pursuers of pleasure, they reckon that their delight in hunting, in fowling or gaming, of whose madness they have only heard, for they have no such things among them. But they have asked us, what sort of pleasure is it that men can find in throwing the dice? For if there were any pleasure in it, they think the doing of it so often should give one a surfeit of it. And what pleasure can one find in the hearing the barking and howling of dogs, which seem rather odious than pleasant sounds? Nor can they comprehend the pleasure of seeing dogs run after a hare, more than one seeing one dog run after the other. For if the seeing them run is that which gives the pleasure, you have the same entertainment to the eye on both occasions, since that is the same in both cases. But if the pleasure lies in seeing the hare killed or torn by the dogs, this ought rather to stir pity than a weak, harmless, and fearful hare should be devoured by the strong, fierce, and cruel dogs. Therefore, all this business of hunting is, among the Utopians, turned over to their butchers, and those, as has already been said, are all slaves, and they look on hunting as one of the basest parts of a butcher's work, for they account it both more profitable and more decent to kill those beasts that are more necessary and useful to mankind, whereas the killing and tearing of so small and miserable an animal can only attract the huntsman with a false show of pleasure, from which he can reap but a small advantage. They look on the desire of the bloodshed, even of beasts, as a mark of a mind that is already corrupted with cruelty, or that at least, by too frequent returns of so brutal a pleasure, must degenerate into it. Thus, though the rabble of mankind look upon these and on innumerable other things of the same nature as pleasures, the Utopians, on the contrary, observing that there is nothing in them truly pleasant, conclude that they not be reckoned among the pleasures. For though these things may create some tickle in the senses, which seems to be a true notion of pleasure, yet they imagine that this does not arise from the thing itself, but from a depraved custom, which may so vervate a man's taste that bitter things may pass for sweet. As a woman with child think pitch or tallow tastes sweeter than honey, but as a man's sense, when corrupted either by a disease or some ill habit, does not change the nature of those other things, so neither can it change the nature of pleasure. They reckon up several sorts of pleasures, which they call true ones. Some belong to the body, and others to the mind. The pleasures of the mind lie in knowledge, and in that delight which the contemplation of truth carries with it, to which they add the joyful reflections on a well-spent life, and the assured hopes of a future happiness. They divide the pleasures of the body into two sorts. The one is that which gives our senses some real delight, and is performed either by recruiting nature and supplying those parts which feed the internal heat of life by eating and drinking, or when nature is eased of any surcharge that oppresses it, when we are relieved from sudden pain, or that which arises from satisfying the appetite which nature has wisely given to lead us to the propagation of the species. There is another kind of pleasure that arises neither from our receiving what the body requires, nor its being relieved when overcharged, and yet, by a secret unseen virtue, affects the senses, raises the passions, and strikes the mind with generous impressions. This is the pleasure that arises from music. Another kind of bodily pleasure is that which results from the undisturbed and vigorous constitutions of the body, when life and active spirits seem to actuate every part. This lively health, when entirely free from all mixtures of pain, of itself gives an inward pleasure, independent of all external objects of delight. And though this pleasure does not so powerfully affect us, nor act so strongly on the senses as some of the others, yet it may be esteemed as the greatest of all pleasures, and almost all the Utopians reckon it with the foundation and basis of all the other joys of life, since this alone makes the state of life easy and desirable. And when this is wanting, a man is really capable of no other pleasure. They look upon freedom from pain, if it does not rise from perfect health, to be a state of stupidity rather than of pleasure. This subject has been very narrowly canvassed among them, and has been debated whether a firm and entire health could be called pleasure or not. Some have thought that there was no pleasure, but what was excited by some sensible motion in the body. But this opinion has been long ago excluded from among them, so that now they almost universally agree that health is the greatest of all bodily pleasures, and that there is a pain in sickness which is the opposite in nature to the pleasure, as sickness itself is to health. So they hold that health is accompanied with pleasure. And if any should say that sickness is not really pain, but that it only carries pain along with it, they look upon that as a fetch of subtlety that does not much alter the matter. It is all one, in their opinion, whether it be said that health is in itself a great pleasure, or that it begets a pleasure. As a fire gives heat, so it be granted that all those who enjoy health is entire to have a true pleasure in the enjoyment of it. And they reason thus: what is the pleasure of eating, but that a man's health, which has been weakened, does with the assistance of food drive away hunger, and so recruiting itself recovers its former vigour. And being thus refreshed, it finds a pleasure in that conflict. And if that conflict is pleasure, the victory must yet breed a greater pleasure. except we fancy that it becomes stupid as soon as it obtained that which it pursued, and so neither knows nor rejoices in its own welfare. If it is said that health cannot be felt, they absolutely deny it. For what man is in health that does not perceive it when he is awake? Is there any man that is so dull and stupid as to not acknowledge that he feels a delight in his health? And what is delight but another name for pleasure? But of all pleasures they esteem those to be most valuable that lie in the mind, the chief of which arise out of true virtue, and the witness of a good conscience. They account health the chief pleasure that belongs to the body, for they think that the pleasure of eating and drinking, and all the other delights of sense, are only so far desirable as they give or maintain health. But they are not pleasant in themselves, other than as they resist those impressions that our natural infirmities are still making on us. For as a wise man desires rather to avoid disease than to take physic, and to be freed from pain rather than find ease by remedies, so it is more desirable not to need this sort of pleasure than to be obliged to indulge in it. If a man imagines that there is real happiness in these enjoyments, he must then confess that he would be the happiest of all men if he were to lead a life in perpetual hunger, thirst, and itching, and, by consequence, in perpetual eating, drinking, and scratching himself, which anyone may easily see would not be only a base but a miserable state of life. These are indeed the lowest of pleasures, and the least pure, for we can never relish them but when they are mixed with the contrary pains. The pain of hunger must give us the pleasure of eating, and here the pain outbalances the pleasure. And as the pain is the more vehement, so it lasts much longer, for as it begins before the pleasure, so it does not cease but with the pleasure that extinguishes it, and both expire together. They think, therefore, none of those pleasures are to be valued any further than as they are necessary. Yet they rejoice in them, and with true gratitude acknowledge the tenderness of the great author of nature, who has planted in us appetites, by which those things that are necessary for our preservation are likewise made pleasant to us. For how miserable a thing would life be if those daily diseases of hunger and thirst were to be carried off by such bitter drugs as we find for those diseases that return seldomer upon us. And thus, these pleasant as well as proper gifts of nature maintain the strength and the sprightliness of our bodies. They also entertain themselves with the other delights let in at their eyes, their ears, and their nostrils, as pleasant relishes and seasonings of life, which nature seems to have marked out peculiarly for man, since no other sort of animal contemplates the figure and beauty of the universe, nor is delighted with smells any further than they distinguish meats by them, nor do they apprehend the concourse or discords of sound. Yet, in all pleasures whatever, they take care that a lesser joy does not hinder a greater, and that pleasure may never breed pain, which they think always follows dishonest pleasures. But they think it a madness for a man to wear out the beauty of his face, or the force of his natural strength, to corrupt the sprightliness of his body by sloth and laziness, or to waste it by fasting. That it is madness to weaken the strength of his constitution and reject the other delights of life, unless, by renouncing his own satisfaction, he can either serve the public or promote the happiness of others, for which he expects a greater recompense from God. So that they look on such a course of life as the mark of a mind that is both cruel to itself and ungrateful to the author of nature, as if he would not be beholden to him for his favours, and therefore rejects all his blessings, as one who should afflict himself for the empty shadow of virtue, or for not better end than to render himself capable of bearing those misfortunes which possibly will never happen. This is their notion of virtue and of pleasure. They think that no man's reason can carry him to a truer idea of them, unless some discovery from heaven should inspire him with sublimer notions. We have not now the leisure to examine whether they think right or wrong in this matter, nor do I judge it necessary, for I have only undertaken to give you an account of their constitution, but not to defend all their principles. I am sure that whatever may be said of their notions, there is not in the whole world either a better people or a happier government. Their bodies are vigorous and lively, and though they are but of a middle stature, and have neither the fruitfulest of soil or the purest air in the world, yet they fortify themselves so well by their temperate course of life against the unhealthiness of their air, and by their industry they so cultivate their soil, that there is nowhere seen a greater increase, both in corn and cattle, nor are there anywhere healthier men and freer from diseases. For one may there see reduced to practice not only all the art that the husbandman employs in manuring and improving an ill soil, but whole woods plucked up by the roots, and in other places new ones planted where there were none before. Their principal motive for this is the convenience of carriage, that their timber may be either near their towns or growing on the banks of the sea, or of some rivers, so as to be floated to them, for it is harder work to carry wood at any distance over land than corn. The people are industrious, apt to learn, as well as cheerful and pleasant, and none can endure more labour when it is necessary, but, except in that case, they love their ease. They are unwearied pursuers of knowledge, for when they have given them some hints of learning and discipline of the Greeks, concerning whom we only instructed them, for we know that there was nothing among the Romans except the historians and poets that they would value much. It was strange to see how eagerly they were set on learning that language. We began to read a little to them, rather in compliance with their importunity than out of any hopes of their reaping from it any great advantage. But, after a very short trial, we found that they made such progress that we saw our labour was like to be more successful than we could have expected. They learned to write their characters and to pronounce their language so exactly, had so quick an apprehension, they remembered it so faithfully, and became so ready and correct in their use of it, that it would have looked like a miracle if the greater part of those whom we had taught had not been men both of extraordinary capacity and of a fit age for instruction. They were, for the greatest part, chosen from among their learned men by their chief council, though some studied it of their own accord. In 3 years' time they became masters of the whole language, so that they read the best of the Greek authors very exactly. I am, indeed, apt to think that they learned that language the more easily from it having some relation to their own. I believe that they were a colony of the Greeks, for though their language comes nearer the Persian, yet they retain many names both of their towns and magistrates that are of Greek derivation. I happened to carry a great many books with me instead of merchandise when I sailed my 4th voyage, for I was so far from thinking of soon coming back that I rather thought never to have returned at all. And I gave them all my books, among which were many of Plato's and some of Aristotle's works. I had also Theophrastus on plants, which, to my great regret, was imperfect, for, having laid it carelessly by while we were at sea, a monkey had seized upon it, and in many places torn out the leaves. They have no books on grammar, but Lascaris, for I did not carry Theodorus with me, nor have they any dictionaries, but Hesychius and Dioscorides. They esteem Plutarch highly, and were much taken with Lucian's wit, and with his pleasant way of writing. As for the poets, they have Aristophanes, Homer, Euripides, and Sophocles, of Aldus's edition. And as for historians, Thucydides, Herodotus, and Herodian. One of my companions, Thriscus Aponitus, happened to carry with him some of Hippocrates' work and Galen's Microtechny, which they hold in great estimation, for though there is no nation in the world that needs physics as little as they do, yet there is not any that honours it so much. They reckon the knowledge of it one of the pleasantest and most profitable parts of philosophy, by which, as they search into the secrets of nature, so they not only find its study highly agreeable, but think that such inquiries are very acceptable to the author of nature, and imagine that as he, like the inventors of curious engines amongst mankind, has exposed this great machine of the universe to the view of the only creatures capable of contemplating it, so an exact and curious observer who admires his workmanship is much more acceptable to him than the one of the herd, who, like a beast incapable of reason, looks on this glorious scene with the eyes of dull and unconcerned spectre. The minds of the Utopians, when fenced with a love of learning, are very ingenious in discovering all such arts as are necessary to carry it to perfection. Two things they owe to us: the manufacture of paper and the art of printing. Yet they are not so entirely indebted to us for those discoveries, but that a great part of the invention was their own. We showed them some books printed by Aldous. We explained to them the way of making paper and the mystery of printing. But, as we had never practiced these arts, we described them in a crude and superficial manner. They seized the hints that we gave them, and though at first they could not arrive at perfection, yet by making many essays they at last found out and corrected all their errors and conquered every difficulty. Before this they only wrote on parchment, on reeds, or on the barks of trees. But now, as they have established the manufactures of paper and set up printing presses, so that, if they had but a good number of Greek authors, which would be quickly supplied with many copies of them, at present, though they have no more of those than I have mentioned, yet by several impressions they have multiplied them into many thousand. If any man was to go among them that had some extraordinary talent, or that by travelling had observed the customs of many nations, which made us to be so well received, he would receive a hearty welcome, for they are very desirous to know the state of the whole world. Very few go among them on account of traffic, for what can a man carry to them but iron or gold or silver, which merchants desire rather to export than import to a strange country? And as for their exportation, they think it better to manage that themselves than to leave it to foreigners. For by this means, as they understand the state of the neighbouring countries better, so they keep up the art of navigation, which cannot be maintained but by much practice.